Introduction to sampling distributions. Recall the main idea of statistics is that we would like to find out how a population thinks or feels about a certain subject. Okay, and instead of talking to every single person in the population to find out how they feel, we can use statistics to choose a sample from the population. And if we choose that sample using a correct method and technique, that sample can represent the entire population. And that would allow us to just study that sample in order to learn about the population. Okay? And our goal would be that we would take that population, take a sample from it, study that sample, and then infer back information about the population. Okay? And this unit really starts us off into statistical inference, which is the goal of statistics, is to take a sample and then infer into the population based on that sample. Okay? So, suppose we're interested in finding out the value of a certain variable in a population. It could be a categorical variable, like political affiliation, or it could be quantitative, like average income. Okay, so we'll be dealing with both types of variables. A census would be the best way to find out the exact value of our variable for the population, but we know that this technique is often difficult, time-consuming, and expensive. Okay, and in today's day and age, the time-consuming part is probably one of the most important aspects of this. We want to make decisions based on data we collect today, okay, not data that's going to take us, weeks and weeks and weeks to collect. Plus, by the time you've got the data collected, over weeks and weeks and weeks, the population could have changed by then, or changed their feelings, based on some event in the world or new information, etc. So nowadays, we really want a sample to get a snapshot of how things are doing right now with that population. So instead of a census, we could take a sample from the population of interest. If we take a good sample, a simple random sample, or a stratified random sample, or a cluster random sample, or a systematic random sample, we can avoid sampling error, okay? Which means that we'll be taking a sample that's going to give us a good representation of the population. We want to avoid those sampling techniques like convenience and voluntary response, right? Because those will not give us a representative sample. So if we collect the data correctly, we can avoid any bias in our data collection as well. So if we use well-worded questions, we don't have interviewer bias, we don't do things to influence the answers or responses. So if we can accomplish these two things, we can get a sample that is representative of the population. Okay? Representative simply means that our sample accurately reflects our population of interest. When we're sampling, we want our sample to be representative. Now, a number that reflects the value for a variable for an entire population is called a parameter. Okay? So if we knew the average income of the entire city of Bloomington, that would be a parameter. Okay? Or if we knew the percentages of Democrat households in the city of Bloomington, in the whole city, that would be a parameter. Okay? For categorical variables, the parameter is called a population proportion, and that's denoted by capital P. Okay, it's easy to remember that one because P, population proportion, they all start with P. Huh? For quantitative variables, the parameter is called a population mean, and it's denoted as mu. Remember, that's mu, Greek letter that stands for population mean. So depending on the variable you're looking at, if it's categorical, we're talking about P's. If it's quantitative, you're talking about mu's. Okay, that's the number we're trying to find about the population. A number that reflects the value for a variable from a sample is called a statistic. Okay, so we're going to collect data and calculate a statistic. Okay, that's based on a sample. We're hoping in the end that statistic gives us a way to estimate the parameter. Okay, like that's what we want. For categorical variables, the statistic is called the sample proportion. It's denoted as P with that caret on top. It's pronounced P hat. Okay, that tells you that number is a sample. Okay, not a population. For the quantitative variable, the statistic is called a sample mean, denoted as X bar, and we've had X bar before. Okay, so it's pretty easy to remember which one are the samples and which ones are the about the whole population. They both have the bar or the caret on top, okay? So those denote that that data is from a sample. And the p and the mu tell us that those numbers reflect a population. The ones that are statistics, so here's a chart that just goes through the symbols that you should be aware of. So if we're talking about a parameter that describes a population, we're talking about a mu. Okay, that's the population mean. This is the population variance, the sigma squared. This is the standard deviation, which is just sigma. Remember the relationship between variance and standard deviation is that the variance is the square of the standard deviation. Or we could be talking about p, which is a population proportion, and that's when we're dealing with a percentage. So all of those numbers are talking about a population. If we're talking about a statistic that describes a sample, then it's either x bar if it's a sample mean, s squared if it's a sample variance, s if it's a sample standard deviation, and p hat if it's a sample proportion. So you should be familiar with all of that terminology, okay? The hardest one is probably the variance. You have to remember that that's the standard deviation squared. So for the following examples, we're going to state whether the boldface number is a parameter or a statistic. Then we're going to use the appropriate notation to describe each number. So this is something you're going to have to be able to do. A random sample of female college students had a mean height of 64.5 inches. Well, that bold number says it was a random sample. So 64 is a statistic. And we would say that x bar equals 64.5. Now, how do I know it's x bar? Because that's not a percentage, okay? That's a measurement. So that's a quantitative variable, which is greater than the 63-inch mean height of all American women. Well, that's a parameter. And since it's a quantitative parameter, we would say that the mean is 63. Okay, so if it came from a sample, it's a statistic. If it's a population, it's a parameter. And obviously, sample and statistic both start with S. Population and parameter both start with P. So it's pretty easy to keep those straight. Let's do another one. The quality manager of a fortune cookie company believes that a larger than acceptable proportion of paper fortunes being used are blank. Suppose she takes a sample of 320 fortune cookies from the production line and finds that 5% of the paper fortunes are blank. Well, that's a sample. Okay, so that would be a statistic. And since it's a sample, it'd be a p hat, and that would be 5%. Then it says this is well above the national average last year of 3% blank fortunes. Well, a national average is a parameter. And since this is a proportion problem, we'd say p equals 3%. Then we have a large container. It's full of ball bearings with a mean diameter of 2.5003 centimeters. This is within the specifications for acceptance of the container by the purchasers. By chance, an inspector chooses 100 bearings from the container and that have a mean diameter of 2.5009 centimeters. Because this is outside the specified limits, the container is mistakenly rejected. So this is the actual mean of the ball bearings in the container. So that's a parameter. And since this is a measurement, that's a sample. So we would, because that's everything in the container, that's a population. So we would say mu equals 2.5003. And then they said they took a sample of 100 bearings from the container. So that's a statistic, where we'd say x bar is 2.5009. Okay. And then the last one, voter registration records show that 41% of voters in a state are registered as Democrats. So that's a population number. So that would be a p equals 0.41. That's a parameter. And then it says to test a random digit dialing service, you use it to call 250 randomly chosen residential telephones in the state. Of the registered voters called 33% are registered Democrats. So that is a sample. So we would say p hat equals 0.33, and that is a statistic. Okay, so you should be able to make those distinctions. Now, let's get into sampling distributions. So suppose we have a population, and we'd like to know what percentage of this population has blue eyes. Okay, we take a random sample of 100 people from this population and ask them their eye color. Suppose 8 out of the 100 we sampled say they have blue eyes, or 8%. Okay, so that came from a sample, so that 8% would be a p-hat. Okay, now, is that the actual percentage of people in our population that have blue eyes? Well, maybe, maybe not, right? It's not a census. We just took a sample. Okay, now we hope that that sample represents the population, but with one sample, it's hard to tell. So maybe, maybe not. If we take another sample, a random sample of 100 people, do you think we would get the same results as our first sample? Well, the answer is no. Okay? If you take multiple random samples from the same population, each sample will most likely produce a little different result. Okay? This is called sampling variability. That's a vocab word. Okay, and we'll define that in a little bit. But it's that every time you take a sample, you're going to get a little different answer. Okay? So a sampling distribution is a probability distribution of a statistic obtained from a large number of samples drawn from a specific population. A sampling distribution of a given population is the distribution of the different outcomes that could possibly occur for a statistic from that population. So the idea is this. If we take multiple samples from the same population, we're going to get a little different answer every time, most likely, and we can make a distribution of those samples. Okay? So a distribution of samples is called a sampling distribution. Okay. In AP Stats, we will be studying the sampling distributions of sample proportions and sample means. So it would be useful to know, if you take multiple samples from a population, how will those samples behave? Like, is there a way we can describe how those samples behave? And could we use all those samples to learn something or infer something about our population? Okay. So a sampling distribution is a probability distribution of sample means or proportions obtained from a large number of samples drawn from a specific population. So you can think of this as being like repeated sampling. We're going to take multiple random samples from the same population. The sampling distribution of a given population is the distribution of the different outcomes that could possibly occur for a sample mean or proportion from that population. Now, the graph below is a sampling distribution of 300 random samples. So basically, I repeated the sampling process 300 times. Each sample consisted of 100 people. We recorded the percentage of each sample with blue eyes. The results are below. Okay, so each dot on this picture represents a sample of 100 people. Okay, it's like that dot right there. It's 100 people. And I asked them, what color eyes do you have? And they answered, and I've got, for that dot means I got 12 out of 100 people. Okay? These dots mean 13 out of 100, or 13%, 15%, 17%. You can see from this group of samples that the highest percentage that answered they had blue eyes was 18%, and that happened twice. On the low end, you can see we got two samples gave us 3 people that have blue eyes. And these are percentages, and they're we only sampled 100 people, so these are out of 100. Okay. A couple things I want you to notice. We did get some repeat answers, right? We got a bunch of people, a bunch of our samples ended up having 10% blue eyes. That would be this pile right here. The highest number, or the highest percentage of blue eyes we got in our samples was 11%, and that happened a bunch of times, almost 50 times, if estimate over here to the y-axis. Okay, so we did get repeat answers, but notice our answers varied anywhere from 3% blue eyes to 18% blue eyes. Okay, so that's sampling variability. That every time we take a sample, we're not going to get exactly the same answer. Okay, but the answers we do get form a distribution. Okay. If you took I'm going to take a change color here. If you look carefully, I could draw a distribution around this kind of loosely, and you can see that it ends up being pretty bell-shaped. Okay, and pretty symmetric. Okay, and that's one thing we're going to find out about sampling distributions is that if we do them right and take big enough samples, that they do end up being pretty bell-shaped. Okay. One thing we'll do with sampling distributions is we will then, once we've got our 300 samples, we will average out those 300 samples. Okay, and this program actually did it for me. The average of the 300 samples ended up to be this little arrow right here, which is just above 9%, 0.092. You can see it up here in the corner too, 0.092. The actual population of people with blue eyes on planet Earth is approximately 9%. Okay, so notice by taking a bunch of samples, if I average them out, I can actually get very close to the actual population parameter. Okay, and that is really the point of a sampling distribution, is that we can get a pretty good estimate of a population parameter by looking at a sampling distribution. Okay. Now, here's another population, a little smaller. This is an example using quantitative data. That last example was categorical. The table below is the population of scores for 10 students on an exam. So I numbered the students 1 to 10, and those are their test scores. The average score on this exam was 69.4. I added them all up and I divided by 10. This is a parameter. It's the actual average score. So that would mean the mean is 69.4. Okay. Now, what I did was I took random samples from this population of size 4. Okay, so basically I threw these 10 test scores in a hat and I randomly picked out 4 scores. Then I found the average of those and I graphed it on the graph below. And I repeated this 2,000 times. Okay, I have a program that does that. So every dot on this graph, and there's so many dots you can't even tell like one individual dot, but every mark on this graph, every tiny little dot, represents one of these 2,000 samples of size 4. Okay, so what happened was, let's say I picked 9, 7, 5, and 2 randomly. I'd average those 4 numbers out, and then that would give me an X bar, and then I would graph that somewhere on this graph. Okay, and then I just kept repeating that process 2,000 times. So you can see again, I get a pretty symmetric bell-shaped graph. Okay, we knew our average was 69.4 for the population. Look at what my average of all 2,000 samples ended up being, 69.446. So again, this demonstrates that if I average out these 2,000 samples, I actually get very close to the population mean. Okay, we have sampling variability again, because you can see, down on this end, I was somewhere around 62 for an average score of my 4 people. And on this end, we got somewhere, around 77. So we had sample means that range from 62 to 77. That's sampling variability. Okay, you can draw an approximately normal distribution around our samples. The average of our 2,000 sample means is 69.446. The population mean was 69.4. So I could use that sampling distribution to predict the population mean. Okay. Now, this chapter, we will be studying sampling distributions to learn about their predictable behaviors. So a couple predictable behaviors we have here is that they turn out to be bell-shaped and symmetric, and we can use them, the average of them, to find the population parameter. Okay. Now, this is an important point. In practice, we'll only be taking one sample to represent our population. but we will use our knowledge of sampling distributions to understand how accurate our sample may be, and to allow us to make appropriate inferences about population parameters based on our sample. So in reality, and if you're being a statistician out in the world, you would get one sample, okay? But knowing how samples behave, we can say, we're more likely to get a sample that's pretty close to the actual mean than we are to get one that's really far away from the mean on either end, okay? And as we learn about this, we'll be able to use that one sample to estimate that population parameter. So here are some terms. Sampling variability. And this is simply when we sample from a population, each time we do it, we will get a little different result. Okay, that's how we ended up with those entire distributions in those graphs. That's sampling variability. Okay, and what this chapter is going to really do is going to teach us about sampling variability, because we can actually quantify it, we can describe it, and then we can use it to our advantage when we're making inferences about a population. One thing we're trying to avoid is bias, which is systematically favoring a certain outcome. Okay. We want to make sure when we take our sample that we are not introducing any type of bias. Okay. We don't want interviewer bias. We don't want fear of retribution bias. We don't want to influence them by the way we write the questions. We don't want to do anything that's going to make our final answer not represent the population in general. Okay, like taking a voluntary response bias, a voluntary response sample would introduce voluntary response bias. So we just want to be careful. We want to use a correct sampling method like simple random, stratify, cluster, or systematic. Okay. Unbiased statistic, unbiased estimator. This is what we want. Okay. We want our sample mean to equal the population mean. Okay. Or we want our sample proportion to equal the population proportion. Okay, that's what we want. When we calculate that sample mean, we want it to reflect the population mean. That's our goal. Okay. In a couple ways we affect that. We take a good sample using a proper method, and the bigger the sample, the more accurate our results will be. Okay, and we'll be studying that. And the variability of a statistic, that is simply how much do our samples vary around the mean. Okay, the more wide range of samples we get, the more variability we have. We would like our samples to all cluster up right around the actual population mean so that we can find it easily. Okay, and we're going to find out that the bigger our samples, the more those sample means will cluster around the population mean. Here are 4 pictures which will help you understand kind of how these interrelate. Okay, you can think of the bullseye in the middle as being the population mean, and you can think of each of these little dots as samples. Okay, so these could be P's, and these also could be P hats, depending on if we're talking about categorical or quantitative data. Our goal is to get what we see on the upper right-hand corner. Okay, low bias, meaning all of our samples are hitting the bullseye or hitting the population mean or population proportion, and low variability, meaning they're not very far apart. Okay, all the samples are kind of hitting the same area. We're going to be able to make a really good estimate of the population mean here. Okay, that's what we want. This is probably the second best right here. This one has low bias, meaning all the dots are right around the population mean in the middle, but it has a little higher variability, meaning that the dots, none of them hit the bullseye exactly, but we've got it surrounded, okay? This means we probably had smaller sample sizes, okay? And up here, we probably had larger sample sizes. And we'll discuss, what that means and how we can understand that. We obviously don't want situations like the upper right, okay? This is bad. It has high bias. If you averaged out all these dots, you would think that the population mean was probably right there, which is wrong, right? Like, we're off. That's bad, okay? So we did something to influence the answers, okay? Those dots are not going to give us a very good picture of what the population mean is. And notice they're not even clustered around very much, so it was probably a small sample. So it's probably a voluntary response sample, and it was a small one at that. And then bottom right, this one's bad too. This one has low variability, so we took a large sample, or large samples. So they all clustered around the same value. The problem is it's not the population mean, okay? We want it to be here in the middle, but it's actually way up here. So it had high bias. So on this one, we took really big samples, but they were bias samples, okay? So we obviously want that upper right-hand corner. This is our goal, okay? But sometimes we'll have to be happy with this one, all right? Either one of those on the right will give us a very good idea of the population mean. The ones on the left, not so much, okay? So we will continue to learn about sampling distributions. Good luck with the homework.